My name is Maya Vance. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've been a diver in the United States Navy. To my father, the world renowned cardiac surgeon Dr. Alistair Vance, this was the equivalent of becoming a professional mud wrestler. He spent my entire life grooming me to follow in his footsteps, to hold a scalpel under the halo of an operating room light. He never imagined that one day his life would depend not on a scalpel, but on a pair of bolt cutters in my hand, 90 feet below the surface of the ocean. He never dreamed that the profession he belittled, the skills he mocked, would be the only thing standing between him and the crushing dark of the sea. Before I dive into the story of that terrible, beautiful day on my father's yacht, the day that changed everything, I want to connect with all of you watching. Let me know in the comments where you're from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt like your choices were a disappointment to someone you love, if you've ever had to fight to prove that your path has value, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is a place for stories about finding your own strength, often in the very last place you or anyone else expected to find it. The annual Vance family getaway was less a vacation and more a command performance. It was always held on my father's boat, a 60-foot yacht he'd christened the Heartbeat RV. The name was a monument to his own ego, a floating testament to the organ that had made him a legend. The boat itself was immaculate, a sterile white world of gleaming fiberglass and polished teak, smelling faintly of lemon wax and the sea. For most people, it would have been a paradise. For me, it was the most beautiful cage I had ever been in. For 3 days, I was trapped with the full weight of my father's disappointment, a pressure far greater than any I'd ever experienced on a deep dive. My father, Alistair Vance, was not a man who dealt in nuance. He saw the world in black and white, success and failure, prestige and squalor, medicine and everything else. In his mind, I had chosen squalor. This year felt heavier than most. I had recently re-enlisted, a decision that had been met with a silence from him, so profound it was louder than any argument. The tension was a living thing on that yacht, coiling in the salty air. It was there at the breakfast table on the first morning, a beautiful spread of fresh fruit, pastries, and artisanal coffee laid out by my stepmother, Evelyn. She was a woman who lived her life as if it were a photo shoot for a luxury magazine, all effortless grace and curated perfection. She meant well, I think, but her understanding of my life was so shallow you could see the bottom. Julian was just telling us about the Ross procedure he assisted on, Alistair began, his voice booming with a pride that was reserved exclusively for my older half-brother. Incredible complexity, replacing the aortic valve with the patient's own pulmonary valve. It's the future, you know. Julian, who was in his final year of a cardiology residency, puffed up like a peacock. He was a paler, softer version of our father, with the same ambition but none of the foundational genius. He basked in the praise, recounting the story with a level of detail designed to exclude and impress. He used terms like autograft and homograft as if they were casual conversational tidbits. I listened, stirring my coffee, feeling the familiar sensation of being erased. "And what about you, Maya?" Alistair asked, finally turning his gaze to me. It wasn't a question of genuine interest, it was a rhetorical pivot, a tool to highlight a contrast. "Done anything interesting with your hobby lately?" Hobby. That was his word for it. 6 years of grueling training, of pushing my body and mind to their absolute limits, of learning to be an oasis of calm in the face of life-threatening chaos, all reduced to a hobby, like collecting stamps or building model airplanes. "We had a salvage operation off the coast of Virginia," I said, keeping my voice even. "A fishing vessel went down in a storm. We recovered the ship's log and some sensitive equipment." Alistair waved a dismissive hand. "Recovery. So you're a glorified garbage collector now. Tell me, Does it pay well, this garbage collecting? The jab landed, sharp and deep, just as he intended. Julian chuckled into his coffee cup. Evelyn just smiled, a tight, uncomfortable expression that suggested she wished the topic would change. It pays enough, I said, my jaw tight, and it's not a hobby, Dad. It's my career. I'm a master diver now. Master diver. He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting something foul. How quaint. It sounds like a character from a children's cartoon. Dr. Vance. Master diver. You see the difference in gravitas, don't you? I didn't answer. There was no point. Arguing with my father was like punching water. It offered no resistance, and you only ended up looking foolish and exhausted. Instead, I focused on the horizon, the endless, indifferent blue of the ocean. It was my world, the one place I felt truly competent, truly myself. Out here on his boat, I was just a reflection of his disappointment. But down there in the deep, I was whole. I thought of my grandfather, my mother's father, who had been a commercial fisherman his entire life. He died when I was 16, but his memory was a lighthouse in the fog of my father's disapproval. He had rough, calloused hands that always smelled of salt and engine grease. He was the one who taught me to swim, not in a chlorinated pool, but in the bracing chop of the Atlantic. He never cared about grades or prestige. He cared about whether you could read the tides, whether you could tie a bowline with your eyes closed, whether you respected the power of the sea. I remembered one afternoon, sitting on the splintered wood of his pier, watching him mend his nets. I was about 15, already feeling the pressure to be a perfect pre-med student. I had failed a chemistry test, and my father had declared it a catastrophe for my future. I was miserable. My grandfather had looked at me, his pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Your father, he'd said, his voice a low rumble. He's a brilliant man, the best at what he does. But he looks at the ocean and just sees the surface. He doesn't understand the world underneath. Don't you ever let a man who only sees the surface tell you the value of the deep. He had looked at my hands, which were already strong and capable, from years of swimming and helping him on his boat. You've got sea salt in your veins, kid. Don't ever be ashamed of it. That memory was my shield. It had to be, because the attacks kept coming. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found me on the aft deck, where I was checking the knots on the fenders. She approached with the cautious air of someone entering a lion's cage, holding a beautifully wrapped gift. "A little something for you, dear," she said, her smile bright and brittle. I opened it. Inside was a thick, glossy medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and tucked inside its pages was a brochure for an accelerated paramedic program. I stared at it, the colorful paper feeling like a slap in the face. "I just thought, she stammered, misinterpreting my silence as gratitude. "You're so capable, and you obviously have a passion for intense situations. This seems like a good way to channel that. A way to have something to fall back on, something a little cleaner, a bridge back to the real world, maybe. A bridge back. As if my world wasn't real. As if the lives I and my teammates saved weren't real. The insult was so profound, so deeply rooted in their shared worldview, that she didn't even recognize it as an insult. To her, she was being thoughtful. She was trying to rescue me from my own poor choices. "Thank you, Evelyn," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "That's very considerate of you." I folded the brochure and tucked it into my pocket. I would throw it away later, when no one was looking. For now, I had to wear the mask of placid acceptance. It was the only way to survive these 3 days. The morning of the second day, my father announced his intention to go diving. It was the real reason for the trip, the main event. He had a favorite spot, a vibrant reef system that bordered a submerged ledge. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of hidden dangers. Storms had littered the area with debris over the years, ghost nets, pieces of old wrecks, a treacherous underwater junkyard veiled in coral. My father was a certified advanced open water diver, a fact he was immensely proud of. But he was a recreational diver, a tourist in a world where I was a citizen. He had all the best gear, a collection of gleaming, high-tech equipment that cost more than my car. He treated diving the way he treated everything else, as a domain to be conquered and mastered through superior intellect and expensive tools. As he began to set up his equipment on the dive platform, I watched him from a distance. He was meticulous, but his process was all about the gear, not the environment. He laid out his regulator, his dive computer, his buoyancy control device, like a priest laying out sacred vestments. Julian was right beside him, an eager acolyte, asking questions and nodding with reverent attention. I saw it almost immediately, a tiny, almost imperceptible fraying on the high-pressure hose that connected his primary regulator to his tank. It was probably nothing. The outer sheath was just worn. But in my line of work, probably nothing was a phrase that could get you killed. We were trained to inspect every millimeter of our gear, to know it so intimately that we could feel when something was wrong. I walked over, trying to keep my tone as casual as possible. "Hey, Dad, you might want to take a look at this hose. The sheathing looks a little worn right at the fitting." He didn't even glance down. He looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. It was the look he gave a nurse who dared to question his diagnosis. "Maya, please. This is a brand new regulator system. It was serviced last month by the best technicians in the state. I think I know how to check my own gear. I've been diving since before you were born." "I know," I said, holding my ground. "I just think it's worth a second look. It's a critical failure point." "Everything is a critical failure point to you people, isn't it?" he scoffed, turning back to his tank. "That's the difference between a professional and a hobbyist. The professional enjoys the experience. The hobbyist, or in your case, the trade worker, is obsessed with everything that can go wrong. It's a defensive crouch. I prefer to operate from a position of confidence." Julian smirked. "She's just being cautious, Dad. It's what they teach them, to be afraid of the water." Afraid. The word was so wrong, so profoundly inaccurate, that I almost laughed. I wasn't afraid of the water. I respected it. I had a deep, intimate understanding of its power to kill, and that understanding was the source of my ability to survive in it. My father saw my caution as fear. I saw his confidence as reckless ignorance. "Just check it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He sighed, a great theatrical exhalation of paternal patience. He picked up the hose, gave it a cursory glance, and dropped it back onto the deck. "It's fine. It's a scuff mark from the gear bag. Now, if you don't mind, Julian and I have a dive to prepare for. Why don't you make yourself useful and help Evelyn with lunch?" The dismissal was absolute. I was sent away like a child who had interrupted adult conversation. I retreated, my stomach churning with a mixture of anger and a cold, creeping dread. He was wrong. I knew he was wrong. But he had made it impossible for me to say anything else. I stood by the railing, watching them, a silent Cassandra on a sun-drenched deck. The stage was being set for a tragedy, and I was the only one in the audience who could read the script. The air on the Heartbeat 4 grew thick with a false jollity as my father and Julian prepared to enter the water. It was a performance for an invisible audience. Alistair was the patriarch, confident and in command, demonstrating the features of his new wrist-mounted dive computer to a rapt Julian. Evelyn drifted around them, phone in hand, capturing idyllic shots for her social media feed. My two favorite men ready for an adventure. Yacht life, family time. I could almost hear the caption being typed. I was, as usual, relegated to the role of stagehand. "Maya, be a dear and handle the guideline, will you?" Alistair called out, not even looking at me. He was too busy adjusting the strap on his mask, ensuring the fit was perfect. I picked up the heavy coil of rope without a word. My hands, calloused and competent, worked the knots with an efficiency that went completely unnoticed. It was just another task, another way I could be useful in a practical sense, while my true expertise was ignored. Before they went in, my father decided it was the perfect time for one more lecture, one more attempt to chip away at my choices. He cornered me near the transom, his expression one of grave disappointment. "You know," he started, his voice low and serious, "I had such plans for us, for this family, a legacy. Vance and Son, of course, but I always imagined you there too. Vance, Vance, and Vance, a true medical dynasty. You have the intellect, Maya. You have my hands. You could have been a brilliant pediatric cardiologist. You have a way with people, a gentleness. You could have done so much good." "I do good, Dad," I replied, my voice strained. "My work matters. It's just different." "Different?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's not different, it's lesser. Can you not see that? A hospital is a temple of healing, of progress. You work in mud and darkness, salvaging scrap metal. You threw your life away, Maya. You took the gifts you were given, a first-class education, a brilliant mind, a family name that opens doors, and you traded it all in for a jumpsuit and a government paycheck. For what? For some misguided sense of adventure? For a sense of purpose," I said, the words barely a whisper. "For a feeling that I belong somewhere." "You belong with us," he said, his voice softening into a manipulative caress. "You belong in a world of achievement and respect, not this." He gestured vaguely at me, at my simple shorts and t-shirt, as if my entire existence could be summed up by my lack of expensive clothing. "It's not too late, you know. The paramedic course Evelyn found, it's a start, a way back." He didn't wait for a response. He simply clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be paternal but felt like a brand, and turned away. He and Julian performed their final buddy checks with a casualness that made my skin crawl, then stepped off the platform and disappeared into the blue with a gentle splash. I watched their bubbles rise to the surface, two shimmering columns that marked their descent. My chest was tight, his words echoing in my ears. "Lesser, threw your life away, a way back." The injustice of it all was a physical ache. Evelyn settled into a lounge chair with a magazine and a fresh mimosa, completely at ease. "He's such a powerful swimmer," she commented idly, not looking up from her page. "Alistair is just good at everything he puts his mind to, isn't he? It's inspiring." I didn't reply. I was too busy watching the ocean, my mind automatically clicking into a professional mode it never truly left. I was tracking their progress, noting the speed at which their bubbles moved. The current was picking up, pushing them south, toward the submerged ledge and the field of debris. Alistair would see it as a challenge to be overcome. I saw it as a variable that demanded respect. On instinct, I walked over to the dive locker. My own kit was stored in the corner, packed and ready as always. It was not fancy. It was standard issue, military-grade equipment, scuffed and worn from hundreds of hours of use. It was functional, reliable, and I knew every inch of it. I pulled out my regulator and checked the seals, tested the purge valve. I ran a quick diagnostic on my dive computer. It was a habit, a ritual. While my father trusted in brand names and service technicians, I trusted only in my own vigilance. My mind cycled through emergency protocols: unresponsive diver at depth, entanglement; out-of-air emergency, equipment failure. For each scenario, I rehearsed the steps, the chain of actions and reactions, the mental checklists that had been drilled into me until they were as natural as breathing. To my father, this was a defensive crouch. To me, it was the definition of professionalism. It was the pact you made with the sea. You respect my power, and I might let you live. I glanced at my watch. They had been down for 22 minutes. Their depth, according to my father's expensive new computer that was linked by Bluetooth to a display on the boat's console, was 87 feet. A little deep for a casual recreational dive, but not unusual for him. He loved to push limits. Then I saw it. The stream of bubbles coming from Julian's position continued its steady, rhythmic ascent. But the other stream, my father's, began to change. It became frantic, a sudden, panicked burst, and then it stopped. Just stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the spot, willing a new stream of bubbles to appear. Nothing. The surface of the water was deceptively calm, sparkling in the sunlight. A few seconds later, Julian broke the surface, ripping his mask from his face. He was screaming, his voice raw with terror. "Help! Something's wrong, Dad. He's stuck. Oh God, he's stuck. His airline is tangled. He's not moving." The world on the heartbeat over shattered. Evelyn shot out of her lounge chair, her magazine fluttering to the deck. A strangled scream escaped her lips, high and thin. Julian, the brilliant resident, the golden child, was a mess of pure, unadulterated panic. He was treading water frantically, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with horror. He was a doctor, trained to save lives, but in this alien environment his knowledge was useless. He was just a terrified son watching his father die. "We have to call someone," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get the boat closer. No, wait, the propellers. Oh God, what do we do?" Evelyn was sobbing, her hands pressed to her mouth, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She was frozen, paralyzed by the horror of the moment. Panic was a contagion, and it had infected the entire yacht. Except for me. In the midst of their chaos, a profound and absolute calm descended over me. It was the strangest feeling. The noise, the screaming, the terror, it all faded into a distant hum. My training, every brutal, exhausting, repetitive drill took over. My mind became a clean, cold, efficient machine. There was no time for fear. Fear was a luxury we couldn't afford. My voice cut through the pandemonium. It was not loud, but it was clear, sharp, and imbued with an authority that stunned them all into silence. "Julian, shut up and listen to me," I commanded. He stopped flailing, his head snapping toward me, his mouth hanging open. "Give me his last known depth and exact position. Point to it, now." He pointed a shaky finger. "There, by the dark patch, 87 feet, maybe 90 now. He's wedged in something." I turned to Evelyn, who was staring at me as if she'd never seen me before. "Evelyn, get on the radio. Now, push the red button. It's channel 16. Pick up the handset and say this. Exactly. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the motor yacht Heartbeat IV. They will answer. When they do, you will tell them our GPS coordinates from that screen. You will tell them we have a diving accident with an unresponsive diver trapped at depth. Do you understand me?" She just stared, her eyes glazed with shock. I grabbed her by the shoulders, my grip firm. "Evelyn, do you understand?" She nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. She stumbled toward the radio, her sobs subsiding into choked gasps. I didn't wait to see if she would follow through. I was already moving, my body a blur of practiced efficiency. I stripped off my shirt and shorts, already in my swimsuit. I strode to the dive locker and began to gear up. Every action was precise, economical, honed by years of repetition. I pulled on my wetsuit, strapped my knife and a small spool of line to my leg. I slung the BCD over my shoulders, the weight of the tank familiar and comforting. I twisted the valve, hearing the hiss of air pressurizing the system. I took a test breath from my regulator. The air was cool and dry. Julian had hauled himself back onto the dive platform. He was shivering, watching me with a look of utter bewilderment. The arrogance was gone. replaced by a raw, helpless fear. He was seeing me for the first time, not as his weird, underachieving half-sister, but as a professional. "What are you doing?" he stammered. "You can't go down there alone. We have to wait for the Coast Guard." "The Coast Guard will be here in 20 minutes for a body recovery if I wait," I said, not looking at him as I cinched the weight belt around my waist. "He has at best 3 minutes of air left, and that's if his line is only pinched and not completely severed. He's probably been holding his breath. He's running out of time." I grabbed a small, powerful set of pneumatic bolt cutters from the emergency kit, a tool my father probably didn't even know he had on board, and clipped it to my BCD. I put my mask on my face, took my regulator in my mouth, and turned to Julian. My voice was muffled by the equipment, but my eyes were clear and hard. "When I get him to the surface, he's going to need oxygen immediately. The emergency O2 kit is in the forward locker. Get it ready. You're a doctor. You can handle that, right?" He just nodded, speechless. The role reversal was complete. He was no longer the star resident. He was the assistant, taking orders from the glorified garbage collector. With a final check, I stepped to the edge of the platform, did a giant stride into the ocean, and let the water swallow me whole. The surface world of panic and sunshine vanished, replaced by the muffled silence and descending blue of my world. The water was cool, a familiar embrace. I oriented myself and kicked down, following the slope of the reef toward the dark patch Julian had indicated. The descent was fast but controlled. My focus narrowed to the task at hand. There was no family drama here, no history of disappointment. There was only a problem to be solved, a life to be saved. My dive light cut a bright cone through the dimming water. At 60 feet, the colors of the reef were muted, mostly blues and greens. At 80, the pressure was a tangible weight, a constant, firm hug. And then I saw him. He was exactly where Julian had said, but it was worse than I imagined. He was entangled in the skeletal remains of an old, rusted-out fishing trawler, a jagged mess of steel ribs and decaying planks that had become part of the reef. He had been exploring a collapsed section of the hull when a piece of debris, likely loosened by the current, had shifted and pinned him. But the real problem, the critical one, was his airline. The hose, the very same hose I had warned him about, was snagged on a sharp piece of metal and stretched taut, bent at an impossible angle. It was compressed, pinched almost completely shut. His tank was on his back, full of air he couldn't access. His eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. My father was a man who projected an aura of absolute control. Now that control was gone. He was just a man, trapped and suffocating, staring at his own death. He saw my light, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment there was confusion, and then a flicker of something else. He wasn't seeing his daughter, the disappointment. He was seeing a helmet, a regulator, a diver. He was seeing his only hope. I didn't waste a second. I swam to him, my movements fluid and calm. First things first, air. I unclipped my octopus, my secondary regulator, and pushed it toward his mouth. He fumbled for it, his movements clumsy with hypoxia and panic. I guided it into place. He sucked on it, a desperate, greedy gasp, and the sweet, life-giving air flooded his lungs. His body relaxed fractionally. He was breathing my air now. His life was literally tethered to mine. Next, assessment. I ran my light over the entanglement. The debris pinning him was a heavy steel plate, part of the old hull. His BCD was caught, but the primary danger was the pinched airline. Trying to move the plate would be slow and could cause it to shift further, crushing him. Cutting the airline was not an option. It was his only connection to the tank he still had. The fastest way was to free him from his own gear. I signaled to him, a series of sharp, clear hand gestures learned through years of training. Stay calm. I am going to get you out. He nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. I moved behind him, my hands finding the clips of his BCD. They were a fancy, complicated brand I wasn't familiar with, but a buckle is a buckle. I worked them open, one by one. I unthreaded the straps, freeing his arms. Then I unclipped the bolt cutters from my BCD. I showed them to him, then pointed at the snagged hose. He understood. With two quick, powerful snaps, I severed the high-pressure hose. It was his gear, his problem. The tank and BCD were now just another piece of junk on the ocean floor. I pulled him free from the wreckage. He was untethered, completely dependent on me. I wrapped my arm around his chest, holding him close. I checked his dive computer. He had been at this depth for too long. A rapid ascent was out of the question. The risk of decompression sickness was enormous. I signaled again. We go up, slow. I began our ascent, kicking gently, my eyes glued to my own dive computer, monitoring our rate. Every 3 feet per second, no faster. I kept his eyes locked on mine, trying to project a sense of calm and control I knew he desperately needed. The man who had commanded operating rooms with an iron will was now as helpless as a child, his survival entirely in my hands. As we rose, the light from the surface began to filter down, growing from a distant shimmer to a bright, welcoming ceiling. We were going home. We broke the surface into a world of brilliant sunshine and noise. The quiet, focused world of the deep was replaced by the frantic energy on the deck of the Heartbeat 4. Julian was at the edge of the swim platform, the emergency oxygen kit laid out on a towel, his face pale and streaked with tears. Evelyn was on the radio, her voice trembling but clear, relaying information to the Coast Guard. She had done what I had told her to do. "Help me get him on the platform," I yelled, my voice hoarse. I was supporting my father's full weight, his body limp and heavy in the water. "We need to assess for decompression sickness and hypoxia immediately." Julian, galvanized into action, leaned down and helped me haul our father out of the water. We laid him on the platform, and the role reversal that had begun 90 feet below the surface was now starkly, undeniably complete. I was the lead medical responder. Julian, the cardiology resident, was my assistant. My training wasn't just in diving, it was in emergency medicine under the most extreme conditions. I was more qualified to handle this situation than anyone on board, including the man whose life was now in my hands. "Check his airway," I commanded, stripping off my mask and fins. "Get that oxygen mask on him. Full flow. I need his pulse and respiration rate now." Julian, to his credit, fell into line. His hands, which I was sure were usually steady in the OR, were shaking, but he did as I said. He fumbled with the mask, and I gently but firmly pushed his hands aside and secured it myself over our father's face. Alistair was barely conscious, his skin had a bluish tint, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of severe hypoxia. "Pulse is 130, thready, respiration is 30, Julian reported, his voice tight with fear. "Okay," I said, my mind racing through a checklist. Hypoxia is the immediate threat. Decompression sickness is the next one. We need to keep him lying flat and on oxygen. Evelyn." She turned from the radio, her face a mess of terror and confusion. "The helicopter is on its way. They said 10 minutes. "Good," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Get blankets. We need to keep him warm to prevent shock." While Julian monitored his vitals and Evelyn scrambled for blankets, I conducted a swift but thorough secondary assessment. I ran my hands over his limbs and torso, checking for any obvious trauma from the debris. My hands, the same hands my father had praised for their steadiness and then lamented for being wasted, were now mapping the extent of his injuries, working with a calm, professional detachment. I picked up the radio handset. "Mayday, Mayday, Heartbeat IV," I said, my voice steady. The Coast Guard dispatcher responded instantly. "This is Heartbeat IV. I am a U.S. Navy diver on scene. The patient is a 64-year-old male, recovered from a depth of approximately 90 feet after an underwater entanglement and out-of-air emergency. He is currently hypoxic and receiving high-flow oxygen. Suspected barotrauma and high risk of arterial gas embolism and decompression sickness. We are preparing for medevac." There was a pause on the other end, then the voice came back, tinged with a new level of respect. "Copy that, ma'am. Your report is crystal clear. That's the best handoff I've had all year. Helo is 5 minutes out. Stay on this channel." I set the radio down. The yacht was quiet now, save for the hiss of the oxygen and the frantic beating of our hearts. Julian was staring at me, his expression a complex mixture of awe and shame. He had spent his entire life looking down on me, secure in his position as the chosen one, the heir to the throne. In the space of 30 minutes, he had watched me command a crisis with a level of competence he couldn't begin to fathom. He had seen that my lesser world had prepared me for a reality that his prestigious one had not. In that quiet moment, while we waited for the roar of the helicopter, my father's eyelids fluttered open. His eyes, cloudy with confusion, scanned the scene. They passed over Evelyn's weeping face, over Julian's terrified one, and then they landed on me. He took in the sight of me, dripping wet, my hair slicked back, kneeling over him with an oxygen mask in my hand. He saw the grit on my face, the salt crusted on my skin, and the unwavering authority in my posture. He tried to speak, but the mask muffled the sound. It didn't matter. His eyes said everything. The arrogance was gone. The disappointment was gone. All that was left was a terrifying vulnerability and a dawning, shattering recognition. He wasn't looking at his daughter, the failure. He was looking at his savior. The roar of the Coast Guard helicopter descended upon us, a chaotic whirlwind of noise and wind that whipped the surface of the sea into a frenzy. The downwash was immense, but I was a rock in the storm. I shielded my father's face as the rescue swimmer was lowered onto the deck. He was all business, a young, focused professional who moved with the same kind of practiced efficiency that I did. We exchanged no pleasantries. It was a language of pure information. "Navy diver," I shouted over the rotor wash. "Patient is stable but critical. Continuous O2 since surfacing. Maintained spinal alignment." "Copy that," he yelled back, his eyes acknowledging a shared world of training and grit. He and I worked together seamlessly to secure my father into the rescue basket. I gave the flight medic a final crisp handover of vitals and events. As they began to hoist the basket up, my father's eyes found mine one last time. He was fully conscious now, fully aware. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was a concession, a surrender. Then he was gone, lifted into the sky, a helpless figure rising toward the belly of the machine that would save him. The helicopter banked and sped away, its sound fading until the yacht was once again cloaked in a stunning silence, broken only by Evelyn's quiet sobs. Julian just sat on the deck, staring at his hands as if he didn't know what to do with them. The sun was warm, the sea was calm, and everything had changed. 2 weeks later, I walked into a private room in the cardiac wing of the very hospital that bore my father's name on its donor wall. He was sitting up in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. The vibrant, commanding force of nature had been replaced by a quiet, reflective man with a new, humbling tremor in his hand, a small piece of neurological damage from the hypoxia. It was a cruel irony. The accident hadn't touched his famous hands directly, but it had ended his career as a surgeon as surely as if it had. The god of hearts had been retired, not by age but by a moment of hubris and a lungful of seawater. Evelyn and Julian were there, flanking the bed like sentinels. When I entered, they both stood, their demeanor entirely different from the last time we were all together. The casual condescension was gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward deference. I was no longer the odd one out, I was the reason the man in the bed was still alive. My father watched me approach, his eyes following my every move. He waited until I was standing by his bedside before he spoke, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual booming certainty. "The Coast Guard. They came to see me," he began, his gaze fixed on the sterile white blanket. "The rescue swimmer, the pilot. They told me what you did. The report you gave over the radio, the way you managed the scene." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Then the doctors here, the neurologists, the specialists in hyperbaric medicine, they explained what happens to the body in that situation, the margin for error. They said that if it weren't for your training, for your calm, for your expertise, I would be dead. Or I would have so much brain damage I'd wish I were. There was no question, no debate." He finally lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were clear, and for the first time I felt like he was truly seeing me. "I was wrong, Maya," he said, the words coming out in a pained, clumsy rush. "I was a fool, an arrogant, blind fool. I was so obsessed with my world, with my definition of success, that I couldn't see the woman you had become. I saw a dirty job, not the courage it takes to do it. I saw a lack of prestige, not the incredible skill. I belittled your world because I didn't understand it, and because it wasn't mine." He looked at his trembling hand. "This whole time I thought I was the expert on saving lives." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Turns out I didn't know the first thing about it. I am so, so sorry." The apology hung in the air, thick and real, the apology I had craved for years. And the strangest thing happened. I realized I didn't need it anymore. The validation I had once so desperately sought from him had been forged in the crushing pressure of the deep, in the cold calm of the rescue. I had proven my worth not to him but to myself. His approval was no longer the prize. "I'm just glad you're okay, Dad," I said, and I meant it. The anger had washed away, leaving behind a quiet, sad peace. The power dynamic between us had been permanently recalibrated. The power was mine now, but I had no desire to wield it. I had just wanted to be seen. Months passed. My father began a slow, difficult journey into retirement. Julian, humbled and changed by the experience, started volunteering with a maritime search and rescue unit, trying to understand the world he had so easily dismissed. Our family was not magically healed, the cracks were too deep for that, but it was different, it was quieter, it was more honest. One evening, I was on the deck of a Navy salvage vessel in the middle of the Pacific, checking my gear for a night dive. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my father. It was a link to a news article, a scientific study on the physiological effects of deep water diving on the human body. Underneath the link was a short message. It read, "Fascinating stuff. Stay safe. I'm proud of you." I stared at the words on the screen, a small smile touching my lips. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was more than I had ever hoped for. I put the phone away and turned my attention back to the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery colors. The ocean was dark and mysterious, a place of immense power and beauty. It was my office, my sanctuary, my home. I had stopped looking for my father's approval in the polished halls of medicine and had found my own worth in the silent, unforgiving deep. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It took me a long time to understand that my value wasn't something that could be given to me by someone else. It had to be earned, for myself and by myself. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who inadvertently push you to become the strongest version of yourself. I'd love to hear from you all. Have you ever had an experience where you were able to prove your worth in a completely unexpected way? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and I find so much strength in our shared experiences. And of course, if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming challenges and finding your own path. Thank you for joining me today. Remember that your worth is inherent. It's not up for debate, and it's certainly not determined by anyone else's opinion. I wish you all strength on your own journeys.